Hey guys, it's been a little while since I've done a video explaining an element or an aspect of the X-Men world, but today's video is going to be a little different than some of my past videos, mostly because Wolverine is a character who is pretty easy to understand in a broad general sense. Nearly immortal mutant, animal rage, experimented on by humans, loyal friend. That's not something that really needs a video to be explained. And no, this video is not going to be a chronological look at all of his backstory, because that would take 3 days for me to do, and I would still miss something and probably get something out of order. Instead, what I'd like to do in this video is talk about how a character can evolve and change over time, and become a different character than what was originally intended. Creator intent is pretty important when reading a story, but sometimes it's overlooked when that intent is ignored and a story goes in a different direction than what was originally intended. For example, Grant Morrison intended for Magneto to destroy most of New York City, kill Jean Grey, and in turn be killed by Wolverine. Later writers ignored this, and so now, when someone goes and reads Morrison's new X-Men, they can take the story with a different experience by ignoring Morrison's original intent for the story. So how does this apply to Wolverine? In my experience, people take those aforementioned elements of Wolverine, nearly immortal mutant, animal rage, experimented on by humans, loyal friend, and they take those elements and they go to the earliest appearances of Wolverine and they read those elements into that version of the character, even though those particular elements are not present in that version of the character. Again, creator intent is important when reading stories that have been going on in a serialized medium for over 40 years. And the creators who molded and shaped Wolverine in the beginning, Len Wein, Dave Cockrum, Chris Claremont, and John Byrne, their intent was not only not in the same ballpark as nearly immortal mutant, animal rage, experimented on by humans, loyal friend, but it wasn't even in the same sport. If you go back to the beginning and forget all of that nearly immortal mutant, animal rage, experimented on by humans, loyal friend stuff, you'd be surprised just how long it took for all of those elements to surface. Before the character was even unmasked, Len Wein wanted to make him a teenager, but he was no longer involved with the character by the time he was finally unmasked. For that matter, there's a rumor that someone wanted Wolverine to have the origin that would eventually be saddled with the Jessica Drew Spider-Woman, namely that he was actually a highly evolved Wolverine and not a mutant at all, though Len Wein has denied that he had anything to do with this idea, so if there is any truth to it at all, it was probably a very early idea that Chris Claremont toyed with. When the character did first appear, all we knew about him was that he was a secret agent working for the Canadian government trying to capture the Hulk. I suspect most fans just assumed that his claws weren't even part of him, but were actually part of his gloves based on how Banshee reacted when he first saw Wolverine without his gloves on, brandishing his claws. This was, I'm guessing, a way to refute fans just assuming something about the character. In fact, we find out almost nothing at all about the character for the first 5 years of his existence. We find out he was good friends with James MacDonald Hudson, who later led the Canadian superhero team Alpha Flight, a team that Wolverine was meant to lead. And that's about it. It was 5 years after Wolverine was introduced that we find out that his name is Logan. Around this same time, we see Wolverine brooding about a possible relationship with Mariko Yoshida. He thinks about how far back she can trace her lineage and how he can only go as far back as his father. This is a big one that shows very clearly that the people guiding this character did not have their heads in the same place that creators did a little over a decade later, as his backstory of a mutant with no memories of his past would seemingly contradict this brief moment in X-Men history. About a year later, we find out that not only does Wolverine have adamantium claws, but that his entire skeleton is covered in adamantium. But despite this revelation, writers were very careful to show that Wolverine wasn't unkillable. If you shot him a dozen times and he kept coming at you without taking a break, his healing factor, while exceptional, would not save him. It wasn't until 1991 that the idea that Wolverine was unwillingly experimented on came up. Fans knew for quite some time that Wolverine had been experimented on, since adamantium was a metal found outside of Wolverine's body, and we knew in the first Genosha story in 1988 that without his healing factor, Wolverine would die because of the adamantium in his body. But it wasn't until almost 20 years after the character was created that one of the most well-known aspects of this character was added to the mix. And there are a few reasons why this one element of his backstory quickly outshined almost every aspect of his backstory from the previous 20 years. 1. Barry Windsor Smith's Weapon X story was very popular, and 2. This was right around the time when X-Men the Animated Series was coming out, which was another extremely popular version of the X-Men, and much of the Weapon X stuff that had only recently been added into Wolverine's backstory was used in that show. From that point on, the character was basically the character that we know today. A lot of the other elements of the character that have been there from the beginning had more slowly and carefully been altered to better fit the series, such as how Wolverine really didn't like any of the other X-Men except for Jean, and would just as soon come at them with his claws than help them in battle. But legend has it that John Byrne, a Canadian man, really didn't like that the only Canadian superhero in comic books was a jerk. And so he took great care to slowly turn Wolverine into a slightly more layered character. By the time Byrne was off the book, Wolverine was more of a grumpy uncle who still had a heart of gold, and much less the berserker who you didn't trust and he didn't trust you. I should say that the point of this video isn't to say that I'm upset or angry that newer elements of his backstory, like the Weapon X background, have eclipsed everything that came in the previous 20 years. That's just how it works. Even when for almost 20 years you had very few people handling the character and controlling what elements were added to his backstory, that doesn't mean that the elements that were originally envisioned for the character were what was going to end up on the final page. And when you consider how many chefs have been involved in the dish that is Wolverine since the 1990s, the character is virtually unrecognizable from what he was in 1975. But I'm okay with that. We've gotten some pretty cool stories because of the way that that works. But the point of this video is to say just how much a character can change in 20 years. And Wolverine's not the only one. There are a lot of characters, even just in the world of the X-Men, who had very different conceptual origins than what they later got on the page. And despite this, many people will go back to the early days of those characters and take the knowledge of the continuity that came years or even decades later and apply it to those earlier stories. There's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but it can be an interesting experience if you try to remove all of that continuity from your mind, and when you go back to read the early adventures of a long-established character, see if you can just take what's on the page. You might be surprised what happens when you do that. So that was my video where I didn't really explain Wolverine, but instead I used him as an example to show just how much a character can change over time. I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And next week I will be back to talking about X-Men stories. But sometime in the future, I will be talking about more aspects of the X-Men world and doing more explaining X-Men videos. So hopefully you guys will be looking forward to that. In the meantime, I hope you guys have a great rest of the day. I'll see you later.